welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful great works of literature
while dressed in elegant clothing, because why the hell not?
So today we're going to be discussing a very famous 19th century French writer by the name of Alexandre Dumas. And Alexandre Dumas became most famous, I think most people probably have heard of him from The Count of Monte Cristo, which was an excellent book. It's pretty big, so I'm not sure if we would pick it up for our own review. It might take us some time to get through it, but who knows, it's a possibility. And he got real acclaim for that work. And later on, after that had been published, he created The Black Tulip, which is a much slimmer novel. And it has certain parallels with The Count of Monte Cristo, in the sense that there's a sort of a political backdrop to much of the story. But while The Count of Monte Cristo seems to be more in the line of revenge, this one builds heavily on a romance. And let me just...
Of two beautiful flowers, a rosa and a tulip.
And a tulip. Let me just give you a bit of a biographical note here on Alexandre Dumas. He was born in 1808 at Villers-Cotterêts. His father was the illegitimate son of a marquis, was a general in the revolutionary armies, and died when Dumas was only 4. And Dumas was brought up in straitened circumstances and received very little education. So he also, I should probably also say another one of his famous ones is The Three Musketeers. Right. Which is somewhat
so it's less
popular.
known work of literature is The Black Tulip, probably.
Yeah, yeah. He ended up dying in 1870. I just kind of wanted to conclude it with that. So what were your thoughts on the book as a whole in terms of the plot? I think you had some difficulties at first, right?
Yeah, the first part was boring.
The first part was boring.
But if you're a history buff, you'd like it.
So why was it boring for you?
Because it was this very long introduction of two characters who weren't all that. Like, they didn't need that much of an introduction for the relevancy of the two main characters. But essentially it starts out with Cornelius and Johann.
DeWitt. The DeWitt brothers.
Yeah. And it's a long explanation about basically how Cornelius Sr. had given very political papers to his nephew, was it?
It was a godson, yeah.
Godson.
Yeah. Very incriminating.
Knowing that it would be safe in his hands as he's not a political man. Mm-hmm. And he wouldn't even be tempted to read it.
In fact, he was a tulip grower.
He's a tulip grower, yeah. Obsessed with tulips
and
in Holland.
This is during the... so this is set in Holland, which is also known for their tulips. And there's all these festivals that they had throughout the year. But this is also during the time... 200 years prior, about 200 years prior to when this book was published, during the Tulipomania. So it was like an absolute obsession. This is an actual historical fact. People were absolutely obsessed with tulips. In fact, like in many instances, tulips were worth much more than human lives, actually. So, yeah.
Yeah, the Black Tulip had a price on it for 100,000.
In the book, yeah.
I don't know what currency.
Florins. Yeah.
Anyway, you can probably go on more about the introduction, but I found it kind of slow at first to get into the plot, and then it was almost like a whole new book once you got into the main plot, and then it quickly picked up speed after that. Yeah, yeah.
And what did you think of sort of how the romance developed between Rosa and the Cornelius?
Very, very typical. Like, it was very typical romance, I think. Yeah. Like the jailer's daughter and a prisoner, but the prisoner in this case is innocent. A lot of times the prisoner is actually guilty of a crime, which was kind of interesting. Well, I guess not always, right? But usually the prisoner tries to escape on some level, use the prisoner's or the guard's daughter to escape. That would be the usual plotline, but that did not happen in this one. Yeah. What about you? What did you think about the introduction to it? Like, did you find that interesting from your perspective?
Not bad. I mean, I think it may have helped to have a little bit of a reading up on French and Holland relations and what was actually happening at the time. Yeah. Because at the time, William of Orange was just coming. He was kind of like the people's monarch, and he was supposed to come and kind of overthrow the French rule. And these De Witt brothers were statesmen for the French. So, so they were kind of like on the out. And it's just a happenstance of the political situation that this guy gets embroiled in these affairs that kind of really don't concern him. But the problem is, Rupert's taking his little chair here, his little seat. The problem is, essentially what happens is he has a competitor, someone who's incredibly jealous and envious of his tulip growing abilities.
Cornelius the Junior, the godson.
Yeah, so the godson, right? Mm-hmm. And so he gets purposely incriminated for potentially inflammatory evidence, and then he goes to jail. And the whole purpose of this mischievous, scheming neighbor was so that he gets imprisoned and then executed, so that he can steal his tulip bulbs, which he was effective at growing these black tulips, which he didn't know whether they would actually work until the very end, until he had seen them flourish. But this reward of 100,000 florins being quite enticing for this guy. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so he's kind of like the evil character, I suppose, in the novel. Mm-hmm. And I found very interesting during the romance between Rosa and Cornelius, she was always testing him whether it was he was concerned more about the flower itself, or whether it concerned about her own love. Yeah.
I think that's like, it's kind of a play on, I think, what women would usually feel early on in a relationship, like, how serious are you about me?
Yeah.
Right? Anyone who is, any person who is more interested in the other person maybe than they seem to be to them, then I think that's a typical jealousy to kind of start early on in a relationship, but the jealousy was of a tulip instead of another woman, right?
Yeah.
Or another lover.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. What did you think of the characters generally?
Generally, I thought the characters were quite easy to take to. They were very
linear.
They were very, very linear, but they were also like kind of playful in a way. They were like kind of pleasant, even though, you know, there are many ways in which they were, the jailer himself was a bit of a nasty character. But many of the other ones, I suppose, Rosa herself, Cornelius De Witt, and even William of Orange was not bad of a character. Mm-hmm. Like he was kind of neutral, I think. He was kind of neutral.
But I think there was an even division between, like, there wasn't a lot of character development in the sense that each one kind of dips into a little bit of each, right? Like the evil character might dip into good a little bit. That never happened. It was like very clear and very even, like balanced with the number of kind of evil characters versus good characters, which was in a sense a relief, or like a pleasure to read, because a lot of times in other literature you get attached to the character, right? And then they start to do things and you're like, get frustrated with them that you wouldn't really want them to. Yeah. Or the ending is tragic and you're frustrated by that too. Like, I feel like a lot of the literature we've read lately has ended with not a so pleasant ending, whereas this was a very romantic and light ending, but the beginning was not romantic or light.
Yeah.
It was
actually quite brutal because
gruesome.
Because it shows kind of like the revolution and how, these statesmen were being torn limb from limb, and that actually echoes what actually happened during the French Revolution and all these other sort of revolutionary sort of mob mass kind of movements, right?
But what I found interesting, it's like a part of the story that I found funny in the sense is that the least political character, right? He just truly was this kind of naive young lad who'd never fallen in love other than with his garden and tulips. He had, like, very quite innocent. He was not affiliated with politics at all, but the political folk believed that there's no way he couldn't have been, having been the godson of one of the most high-powered people. Statesman, so he was condemned to death, really, and just barely escaped that. Just by fate and through. It was very, in a way, a biblical. There's a biblical, I guess, moral to it, in the sense that if you believe in God and believe in that you will eventually be saved in some way.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
right? Like the characters were at every stage. It was like at every stage where he was about to die or have a fatal
God's hands
or his tulip was about to die. It was, and he had no control of it. He turned to God, and then it was again.
He kind of like gave it up to God, as if like, you know.
Yeah.
God willing, whatever happens, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then it was a positive ending, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing I really wanted to mention was, I'm not sure how believable this is, but maybe it's more unbelievable for a modern audience, but it seemed that, you know, he was more devoted to his tulips and more concerned about his tulips surviving than actually himself.
In the beginning,
at the beginning, from sort of the executioner's axe and being condemned. And obviously, like, you know, there's an element in which this is just kind of like, you know, fictitious, sort of shows how much he was so involved in his tulips. But I'm reading memoirs from Chateaubriand, and, you know, he lived around this time as well. And I think, you know, there was, around this time period, the 18th century, I suppose, and early 19th century, I think there's a different relationship to death. I think people were more willing to not just necessarily fall into despair about death, but to accept death and to meet it with a sense of sort of, not cowardice, but like meet it with a sense of strength and necessity, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. To accept their fate and to do it boldly and honorably. And like, I guess, I just found it interesting, but you were going to mention, I think you were mentioning the fact that he did change his relation to death and his thoughts on death.
Right before the execution.
But when he was meeting Rosa, right?
Well, yeah, that's what he said. He, like, right as he was about to be executed, he was somewhere between acceptance and not. Like, all of a sudden he had this desire to live because he was in love.
Yeah.
Right? And then it took literally Rosa also later on, once he was sent to, I guess, life imprisonment instead as an exception. It took literally Rosa asking him point blank, who do you love more, the tulip or me? Essentially, for him to realize how much she meant to him as a person.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I kind of see him as someone who has their real obsessions. Like, some people just really have a love for collection of something or a sport.
Yeah. Or an AD fix, you know, like an idea that it completely, like, obsessed about, you know.
And sometimes it takes that, like, kind of, hello, wake up.
Yeah.
Do you even care about me as a person?
Yeah. To
wake them out of that, right? So I think that was very relatable, that component of it.
I hope you're not suggesting that I'm the person who's just thick-headed about certain things. No, but yeah, very interesting.
His like pursuit of the tulip being named after him and everything was for fame, but actually I think it was probably more to share that love of beauty with the world. Really, in hindsight, I realized that was probably what it was. Like, he was truly in love with it, but wanted to share that love with everyone. Yeah.
I think, like, it kind of, like, brings this idea of, like, the gardener, it is kind of like helping a divine act emerge. Like, you are helping give birth to, like, you know, God's creation, if you will, right? And that's why a lot of the time, even throughout the novel, there was that kind of relating it back to this the divine world, right? That these flowers are manifestations of the beauty and the splendor of nature and the earth, right? And the divine. And the gardener isn't necessarily someone who creates it themselves, but gives birth to it through kind of like a midwife to it. But it was interesting, I guess, in the sense that it was working upon nature to improve it in a sense, to bring it up to even a state of absolute wonder and uniqueness. Because the black tulip, that doesn't exist in nature. Like black, I remember reading this somewhere, like black doesn't exist as a color in nature. It's like naturally, it's like everything is like a very dark brownish color, but never you find pure black. And it's part of this combination when you're cultivating a garden and you're growing plants and growing flowers. It's a mixture between a human art and the human artifice and sort of the natural powers.
I'm sure there's a lot of symbolism there too.
I'm sure,
right?
Yeah.
And also the fact that, again, I found it interesting that this very Cornelius, the actual DeWitt, or the senior, his dying letter to his godson Cornelius was in a Bible, and then that passage was ripped out of the Bible.
Yeah, the page. And
he wasn't he still died, but in the end, again, it literally was in two situations where that same Bible was written upon and that saved the main character's life. So there has again, I think
there's a hope there.
That was very literal symbolism, right? Where it's so obviously there's a lot of symbolism in there that's not as obvious, but then that one was very obvious to me that, again, it was literally the Bible that saved the flower's life, and this
to go to its rightful owner. It was wrapped up in the bulb. The bulbs are wrapped up in the page, right?
Yeah. Where the truth came shining in on the present situation, so that the tulip could go to the rightful owner as a result of that passage, right?
Yeah.
And then I also found it very interesting that usually there's one character that's this archetypal, I guess, character of innocence and purity, but I think it was maybe one of the first novels that I can recall at this time where the two main characters were both very pure, and really nothing tainted that pureness.
Interesting.
And even the fact that the first book really that Rosa ever read and that Cornelius helped her to read was the Bible. There was very anyway, it was very obvious that there was a lot of
religious symbolism.
Yeah.
I also found it very interesting how in many ways things don't really change in terms of the mob violence. You know, how people can be so stirred up, I guess, in their passions, in their anger and their resentment, and use it as a means to justify even the most horrendous acts. And it just seemed very interesting. I mean, obviously these things happened in history, and it's just interesting to meditate upon the circularity of history and how things don't, cyclical nature, how things don't really change. But circumstances maybe, but not the actual acts.
I think that's what made this book kind of cheeky too, because it showed both how evil happens politically for this pursuit of, the betterment of all people, and get diluted into that very easily, and that's a cyclical, historical kind of presence, and how easy it is to fall upon, to justify your evil acts, right? But then on the flip side, it showed how it can be the almost silliest pursuit, that again you do so many evil, the other gardener, the neighbor who was trying to steal this tulip and would go to gross means, he ended up accusing Cornelius of conspiracy against the state, just so that he could get this rose, and then tulip. I keep saying rose because of Rosa. Get the tulip, and then it just got the more and more lost he got in that pursuit, the more and more he decided in his mind that this is what he needed to have.
Right.
There was no changing that path, no matter what atrocity he had to commit.
Yeah.
Death of a person, lying, murder, doesn't matter.
Thievery.
All these crimes for a silly thing. And in the end, he still justified it.
And it was interesting because he touched upon it when he was like, because the neighbor climbs into the backyard to like rummage around and steal it when obviously Cornelius is in prison, and then realizes it's not there. So he's like, well, I've already committed one act of theft. I may as well go inside and see if there's something hidden there. Mm-hmm. So he mentions it, like it's through one act of sin, if you will, or one sort of reckless sort of move, doesn't immediately necessitate that somehow you've retracted it and you feel bad or guilt-ridden for it. It will compel you to do even more perhaps dastardly things, because you will be able to reason that what you are doing is, well, I've already gone past the point of no return, I may as well just keep going.
That's it. That in both cases, whether it was politically or for the flower, both of the kind of evil characters in a sense went beyond where they could then turn around and just try to pursue a better path, or path of righteousness. Or more, exactly. More moral, I guess, path. Moral path, But it was very interesting. Those subtle details that are captured make you reflect upon it, right? In terms of the human condition. Yeah, I do enjoy Alexandre Dumas. It's something I read first time a long time ago, probably in my 20s, and sometimes it's nice to just take something like this and you don't have to really think too hard about it. It just flows quite easily. You really don't in between. Think too hard about it.
Yeah.
All right, ready? Boom. What's your rating?
I'm gonna give it a solid 4 out of 5.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with you on that one.
Yeah.
Give it a 4.
Yeah. It's a nice story. If you can get past sort of the political intrigue part, and some people like that sort of thing. Yeah. But it is.
I don't think historical. You disliked it.
No, I didn't dislike it at all. No, just like the historical element of it. Obviously, I find parts of it confusing. I don't understand all of the different sort of details of what the historical situation was. But it's definitely worth a read. And certainly, I would also recommend The Count of Monte Cristo. I haven't personally read The Three Musketeers, but if any of you out there have actually read it, please let us know in the comments if you've enjoyed it, or if you've read any other Alexandre Dumas novels that you feel would be interesting. Actually, I have read The Last Cavalier, and that was also by Dumas, and that was an interesting one in terms of, it was very action adventure. But yeah, this one was a nice romance that we could actually touch upon.
For me. You did it for me.
Yeah.
How romantic.
Oh, indeed. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Have a good night, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.